look for me in a world when I look up.
Tenamwadi, be thankful unto the Mother, Father, creative life force of the universe. Kudzai, Mudzimo, Mukuru. We give praises unto our great ancestors because our ancestors are worthy to be praised. Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodi, African power and African liberation for all African people. Garvey lives, MOSIAH lives. Greetings and welcome, brothers and sisters, to this special presentation celebrating the life and legacy of the most eminent prophet, His Excellency Marcus Mosiah Garvey, brought to you via Kimbunga Media on the day of his birth. This is the birthday of the prophet, and we're going to honor him by delving deep and doing some analysis of one of his speeches. And so we say MOSIAH lives as we go forward. Our subject today is MOSIAH and the political economy of war, capitalism and the state. Capitalism and the state is in fact the title of an editorial that Papa Garvey wrote for the Negro World newspaper in the year 1923. And it can be found, the editorial, in Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, Volume 2. And so this was an idea from last year to actually do an analysis of this speech. And in preparing the presentation, because of the fact that the world as we know it is experiencing so much in relation to the subject of war, I thought it was appropriate to actually delve in to the subject of war, because this is actually the theme of this particular speech. And while I was preparing the presentation, I was reminded of the fact that last year during the month of MOSIAH, our UNIA ACL sister, Sheila Brown, in fact, did a presentation entitled The Garveys Speak to Us of War, whereby she was detailing the perspective of Papa Garvey and Mama Garvey, namely Queen Mama Amy Jakes Garvey, in relation to this subject. And she encouraged us and implored us and gave us the responsibility to speak more on this particular subject from a universal African nationalist perspective. And so we are taking up the charge today, brothers and sisters, and love and respect to our sister Sheila Brown as we do so. So as said, the name of the presentation is MOSIAH and the political economy of war, and we will be drawing from Papa Garvey's editorial, Capitalism and the State. And let's get into this right now, as them say, brothers and sisters, we're living in a time of war and rumors of war. So let's see what Papa Garvey had to say about war. The editorial begins. Capitalism is necessary to the progress of the world, and those who unreasonably or wantonly oppose it or fight against it are enemies to human advancement. Now, this is a very interesting opening, and in some corners, a very controversial one. I became aware of this pronouncement partly because there were many people who consider themselves to be socialist or communist who charge Papa Garvey with being a capitalist, and they're critical of Papa Garvey because of this charge. They say this man was a capitalist and therefore he lacked revolutionary fervor and ideology. And this particular statement was used as evidence of this particular claim. And that really derived from the white left, particularly in the Communist Party and the Socialist Workers' Party, but many Africans who are Pan-Africanist and socialist leaning have taken up that particular charge and used this particular statement as evidence of said charge. And then there is a group of people who are adherents and advocates of the capitalist system. They are neoconservative, liberal, neoliberal advocates who are against socialism and communism, and they attempt now to co-opt Papa Garvey as an advocate of capitalism and claim that capitalism was in fact his economic philosophy, and not only his economic philosophy, but his economic goal, black capitalism, or just capitalism without even the blackness. Yeah, that Papa Garvey was advocating our involvement and immersion into the capitalist system, that his goal was to develop or involve black people, African people, ultimately in the capitalist system. And those who are advocates of the capitalist system use this particular statement as well as evidence for their particular claim. It's interesting that those who make that claim from a capitalist perspective tend not to, in the co-opting of Papa Garvey as a capitalist, tend not to focus on any other aspect of his legacy. They dispense with the need for self-reliance and African nationhood. They dispense with the anti-colonial agenda of Papa Garvey. They dispense especially with the need for race-first organizing among African people, and simply try to paint Papa Garvey as a capitalist. It's a very interesting point. But because today, this is not the focus of our presentation, another day, we're going to be going into whether capitalism was in fact the political, economic philosophy and ideology of Papa Garvey and the UNIA-ACL, and whether capitalism was in fact the goal of Papa Garvey and the UNIA-ACL. But that is not today's subject. What I want to highlight, though, is that taking this particular statement from the broader context of the speech negates the fact that the speech in its entirety is in fact a critique of capitalism, is in fact a critique of the capitalist system that Papa Garvey and the African world was existing in at the time that this editorial was written in 1923. And the evidence of that fact comes in the very next line of the editorial, which says, but there should be a limit to the individual or corporate use or control of it. Once again, there should be a limit to the individual or corporate use or control of it. Now, for many people who claim to be an advocate a capitalist political economy, this would be sacrilege, because they tell us that the capitalist economic system is designed to maximize the productivity and or ability or capacity of the individual to acquire profit and private possessions. And within the capitalist system as we know it, there are very few, if any, differences between an individual person and an individual corporation, because corporations are considered to be persons, individual persons by law. And so for a neoliberal or a liberal advocate of capitalism, the idea that there should be limitations on the individual or corporate use of capital or the capitalist system would in fact be considered something other than capitalism, brothers and sisters. That's a very interesting point right there. But what does Papa Garvey mean when he says there should be limitations or controls on the controls? He goes on, no individual should be allowed the possession, use, or the privilege to invest on his own account more than $1 million, and no corporation should be allowed to control more than 5 million. Beyond this, all control, use, and investment of money should be the prerogative of the state or the government of a country, with the concurrent authority of the people. So here Papa Garvey is advocating for an economic system in which the system itself runs to the advantage of the masses of the people at large, and that the government is there and is designed to act in the interest of those masses. And he is putting forward the idea, the policy, that the control of the individual or corporate use, placing limitations on the individual or corporate control of capital, is one such way in which to achieve that goal. There's more to go into, where that particular statement is concerned. But again, that is not our subject today. When we deal with Papa Garvey, the UNIA, ACL, and capitalism, we will, engage the permutation, nuances, and implications of this particular statement. But for now, let us move on. He says, with such a method, we would prevent the ill will, hatred, and conflicts that now exist between races, peoples, and nations. Modern wars, he says, are generally the outgrowth of dissatisfied capitalistic interest, either among foreign or strange peoples or nations. Now, I'm not sure exactly why Papa Garvey used the word strange as well as foreign to describe the people them and the nation they where my talk about, but it's just interesting phraseology, yeah? But what we are emphasizing here is the fact that he has identified as a motivating factor behind the warfares that the world is currently experiencing. And just by way of context, that this speech being delivered, this editorial being written in the year 1923 is but 3-4 years after the conclusion of mass European War One, brothers and sisters. Mass European Tribal War One, what them call World War One, which at the time was the biggest and most destructive war that the planet Earth had ever seen. And there was already speculation, even though that particular war had concluded, that more wars were to follow. The United States of America had a generation or two previously experienced the American Civil War. And then a number of wars had been sparked throughout Mama Africa, throughout the Caribbean and South and Central America, throughout Asia. And in many of these wars, the motivating factor was colonialism. We're talking about the late 1800s into the early 1900s. We're talking about the period of the scramble for Africa. We are talking about the period of, for example, the Port Bogle Rebellion in the island of Jamaica, fighting against colonial laws that restricted the prosperity of the masses of the African people on the island. And so this is an environment in which warfare is an everyday fact of life, and the planet Earth had experienced a mass European war in which the rest of the world was dragged into the war by virtue of the fact that the warring factions were colonial empires across the planet Earth. And Papa Garvey is saying to us that modern wars are generally the outgrowth of dissatisfied capitalistic interests, either among foreign or strange peoples or nations. In other words, the capitalists from the colonial nations are expanding their power and their influence across the world, and that fact is fomenting more warfare. Papa Garvey continues, until a universal adjustment takes place, the state or nation should have the power to conscript and use without any obligation to repay the wealth of such individuals or corporations. Imagine that, man. When the people them quote unquote private property. Have mercy. Until a universal adjustment takes place, the state or nation should have the power to conscript and use without any obligation to repay the wealth of such individuals or corporations through whose investment or interest in foreign countries or among foreign or strange peoples wars are fomented and made, in which the nation is called upon to use its military or naval power as a protection of the rights or interests of such citizens when the conflict cannot be prevented or settled otherwise. Again, Papa Garvey is emphasizing this point, that these capitalistic interests are sending the peoples of even the capitalist nations, the working peoples, the poor peoples of the capitalistic nations, to go and fight all around the world in the interest of the capitalists. And that situation should not be allowed to continue. Papa Garvey goes on. The innocent citizens of the country should not be called upon to make sacrifices in men, money, and other resources, as is generally done in times of war, and those most interested or responsible by their acts of selfishness go free, or only bear but a proportionate part of the burden. The entire burden of the war should rest upon and be the responsibility of those whose interest brought about the difficulties, and they should be made to pay the full cost of the war. The capitalistic interest, those who are invested and seek to gain from the capitalist interest, the leaders of the corporations, those who are in government, they should foot the bill for the war and pay for the entire burden. That just means now not just the monetary and the resources, but even the manpower. They should be made to carry the entire burden of the warfare that is in their interest. Then we get to the interesting part of the speech now. Him say, men like Morgan, Rockefeller, Firestone, Doheny, Sinclair, and Gary should not be allowed to entangle the nation in foreign disputes leading to war. And notice that, foreign disputes leading to war, for the sake of satisfying their personal, individual, or corporate selfishness and greed, for more wealth at the expense of the innocent masses of both countries. I'll concession, and notice that he puts concessions in inverted commas. I'll concession in Mexico or Persia, rubber concession in Liberia, West Africa, sugar and coffee concession in Haiti, West Indies, to be exploited for the selfish enrichment of individuals, sooner or later end in disaster. Hence, ill feeling, hate, and then war. Let us unite and stop it for the good of the people and the nation. So in a bit, we're going to get into a definition of this term concessions and what it means. But Papa Garvey is saying that these, for now, let's just use the word privileges. Papa Garvey is saying that the interests of these capitalist individuals and corporations are being extended in other nations. And because they're capitalistic as a means or a consequence of their capitalistic interest, they are exploiting the people of other nations. And the people of those nations are responding dissatisfied, rebelling against the concessions and the exploitative nature of the concessions in relation to themselves. And that fact inspires a rebellious response from said people, and that situation leads on to war. Papa Garvey continues, the trick of the selfish capitalist is to stir up local agitation among the nations, have them shoot or kill some of the citizens of the capitalist country. An American citizen was shot, and a British citizen was shot, a French citizen was shot. Then he influences the agencies of his government to call upon the home authorities for protection. A harsh diplomatic note is sent that inspires an insult or further injury. Then an ultimatum is served or a demand made for indemnities or war declared with the hope of arresting from the particular weak, unfortunate country such territories where oil, rubber, and other valuable minerals or resources are to be found. This kind of dollar diplomacy is a disgrace to our civilization, and for the sake of humanity should be stopped. By way of some more context, this is also the period in which the United States government had the nation of Haiti under occupation. Papa Garvey already mentioned Haiti. And this is one of the tricks that was exactly done in Haiti. They invaded the nation on behalf of corporations and financiers on Wall Street, brothers and sisters. Do your research into the occupation of Haiti during this period. And when the people rebelled against the occupation, they put out the propaganda that American citizens and the American armed forces were being attacked. And that the response, therefore, was to send in even more troops, yes, and reinforce the occupation of the nation. That occupation lasted for the better part of 20 years between 1915 and 1934. And so in 1923, we were 8 years into the US occupation of Haiti. And so in part, Papa Garvey is responding and referring directly to that occupation when he makes this speech. And on this particular last line, this kind of dollar diplomacy reminds me of a statement that Papa Omowale Malcolm X would make some 40 years later, where he was on the African continent and wrote a memorandum for the OAU, the Organization of African Unity. And he said, he warned our brothers and sisters on the continent about the United States of America as an imperialist nation, a Western and European imperialist nation. And he said not to come from under the yoke, to throw off the yoke of European colonialism, only to become a victim of United States dollarism. Papa Garvey says that kind of dollar diplomacy is a disgrace to our civilization and for the sake of humanity should be stopped. So now, Papa Garvey brings a number of names in this editorial. Morgan, Rockefeller, Firestone, Doheny, Sinclair, and Gary. Who are these people and why is Papa Garvey calling them by name? Let us explore who exactly these people are. First up, John P. Morgan, and you can see his birth and death dates there. Big in finance, banking, the building of railroads and industrial consolidation, which means the linkages and connections between various different industries. Yeah, and so these banks became a means by which to consolidate various different industries, particularly in the Western world, particularly as a means of industrialization and imperialist expansion in the world. Companies founded, you may have guessed, J.P. Morgan and Co., the big blow-up bank that still exists to this day, brothers and sisters. He was also instrumental in the creation of General Electric, US Steel, and International Harvester, many of which have a significance and a continued life and legacy in today's world. Involvement in war, because that is our subject for today. J.P. Morgan was significantly involved in financing the so-called Allied powers, which is the Western world or Western Europe, during mass European tribal war I, and provided massive loans and arms deals to the nations that made up the Allied powers. Political involvement, specific to the United States of America, played a central role in the Gilded Age plutocracy. Gilded Age plutocracy, brothers and sisters. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Where financiers had outsized influence on public affairs. A plutocracy, for those who may not be aware, is simply a government that is run by and in the interest of the wealthy. And the Gilded Age refers to a period of time, particularly in US history. This relates to the 1870s through to like the turn of the century, so that 1900, roughly speaking, whereby this was the era in which Western capitalism and industrialization fast-tracked. It was the rise of a number of major corporations and big capitalists. There's a lot of men, really a few men, who were making a whole heap of money during that period of time. But also, as a result of all of this, their open influence of the politics and the economy of the nation of the USA was said to be outsized. Yes? Effectively, the nation was being run in their interest. And so J.P. Morgan was one of the central figures of this Gilded Age era. And he is also accused of monopolistic practices. He was investigated as a part of the Pujo Committee hearings in 1912 to 1913 over the concentration of power on Wall Street. We're not going to go into the Pujo Committee hearings, but for those who want to do their own research following this point, the Pujo Committee hearings is a congressional investigation into the concentration of finance power on Wall Street, particularly among a small group of bankers and financiers. And this committee came out with a number of findings, and as a result of these findings, they instituted antitrust laws, which basically refers to laws to promote fair competition, and prevent monopolies that were existing around that time. And it also led to the creation of the Federal Reserve. Again, another subject for another time, but the Federal Reserve was designed for the purpose of challenging or balancing the power of these big private financiers. Now there's all kinds of contradictions where that is concerned, and there are many people in the American system who challenge the power or the legitimacy of the power of the Federal Reserve, but that is not our subject today. I'm just putting that out there for those who want to do more research. Global involvement. As a major banker, J.P. Morgan had a role in financing and otherwise supporting European colonial infrastructure. Now, bear in mind, brothers and sisters, that colonialism wasn't just acts of government, the British government, the French government, the Portuguese government, etc., etc., etc. All of these governments acted through companies and corporations. And the corporations and the companies also acted in and through the government. There is a seamless relationship between political interests in the colonial world and corporate interests in the colonial world. They were never and never have been separate and distinct. Let us understand that. And so when we talk about financing and otherwise supporting European colonial infrastructure, J.P. Morgan, as a big international bank, had a role in the financing and the administration of the money of colonial corporations throughout the world. For example, many of the corporations under King Leopold from Belgium that were exploiting the resources and labor of African people in the Congo under the reign of King Leopold, J.P. Morgan is heavily involved. The institution, J.P. Morgan and Co., heavily involved, yes, in the administration of all of that money, brothers and sisters, and the companies that were involved. Yeah, that's just one example. Let us move on. John D. Rockefeller, a man who, and a name who many of us would know, big in oil, founded the Standard Oil Company, which was eventually broken up into Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, etc. under antitrust action. We're going to come back to that in a second. But just bear in mind that whereas Standard Oil was broken up into these various different companies, today Exxon and Mobil is now Exxon Mobil. Yeah, so they've had a unification, a reunification of Exxon and Mobil, and I think that took place in about 1999. So Exxon and Mobil became Exxon Mobil and is operating wherever there is oil in the world. You find Exxon Mobil along with Chevron, along with BP, along with Shell. All right. Involvement in war. Standard oil products essential in mass European wars 1 and 2. So much of the armory, the tanks and the ships and the planes and were fueled by Standard Oil products. Even much of the lubrication of the different machinery, Standard Oil products. Political involvement. Central figure in monopoly and antitrust cases. And so as it suggests, there are investigations into the power that these men and their corporations wield. And as a result of this, a lot of these companies are broken up. And John D. Rockefeller is one of the central targets of this particular antitrust vibration. And you can check out the Ida Tarbell's expose if you want more information on that. Rockefeller is accused of influencing politics through philanthropic donations via the Rockefeller Foundation. Global involvement helped to establish US dominance in global markets. This thing about the United States being obsessed with oil is over 100 years old, brothers and sisters, and was in fact established by John D. Rockefeller. In South and Central America, the so-called Middle East and Southeast Asia, often competing with the British Dutch company Royal Dutch Shell. Now, you may notice that a lot of the companies that I'm naming, brothers and sisters, still exist today and still exist in many of the areas of the world in which African people are a majority. You will find all of these companies in Nigeria and Sudan and Trinidad and Haiti and more recently Guyana, brothers and sisters. Bear all of this in mind. Just a quick note on this reference to philanthropy and the Rockefeller Foundation. We're talking about a number of different things here. Rockefeller Foundation is known for funding various different initiatives, and particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, they're known for funding educational initiatives during and post this period of time, much of which reinforce colonial education and Eurocentric education in Africa and the Caribbean. They are also known to have funded public health initiatives, but much of which were designed to maximize the productivity of exploiting African and Caribbean workers in various different nations. So really, rather than the emphasis of the program being public health, it was ensuring that there were enough workers to be more productive within said nations. Yeah. Then we have their influence on policy and soft power, how America exerts its power in the world in ways other than just through military might. The Rockefeller Foundation has funded the training of government personnel, people that work for the government in the civil service, training advisors to various different African and Caribbean governments. And when we see the policies that come out of our majority African nations around the world, understand that it is the result of training, not just through the formalized education system, but via the direct training received by initiatives funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Then we have the Green Revolution in Africa and the Caribbean. When we talk about the Green Revolution, we're not talking about going green and sustainable technology and so on and so forth. We're talking about things like hybrid seeds, yes, and chemical fertilizers. So basically, effectively, the agricultural systems and industries within our nations were shifted and changed to meet the demands and the interest of major Western corporations. And a lot of that work was funded via the Rockefeller Foundation. So when we see Monsanto and Roundup, Monsanto seeds and Roundup fertilizer all over our nations, a lot of this is linked to the work of the Rockefeller Foundation, which obviously often kills off the indigenous seed crops. And because they have patented certain seeds, the economy is designed in such a way whereby in order for your products to be viable on the global economy, you have to buy these patented seeds from companies like Monsanto and use fertilizer like Roundup. And there are various different court cases out there in relation to both of, well, in fact, Roundup is a subsidiary of Monsanto, brothers and sisters, yeah? Let's move on. The infamous, the notorious Harvey Firestone in rubber and the automotive industry. Companies founded, Firestone Rubber and Tire Company, or Tire and Rubber Company. War involvement, supplied tires and rubber products to the US military during both of the mass European tribal wars. Political involvement, Firestone Rubber Company benefited from government contracts and colonial resource deals. We're going to come back to that shortly, so stay tuned. Advocate of anti-union policies. This man was vehemently against the organization of workers, even white workers, brothers and sisters. And that fact would have placed him in opposition to Papa Garvey just right this one, because Papa Garvey, much of his activism and his leadership in organization began as a representative and advocate of organized labor in unions. Global involvement established the Firestone Rubber Plantation in Liberia in 1926, one of the largest American quote-unquote investments. And we put investments in quotes here, just like Papa Garvey put concessions in quotes in Africa. We're going to come back to that, so do stay tuned. Let us move on. Edward L. Doheny. Papa Garvey mentioned Doheny. Companies founded, Pan-American Petroleum and Transport Company. Major figure in the development of Mexican oil fields. War involvement. His company supplied oil during World War I, Mass European Tribal War I. Political involvement. Major donor and a beneficiary of Warren G. Harding's administration, particularly through the Teapot Dome scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal is basically revolved around the secret leasing of oil reserve, Navy, federal oil reserves preserved for the US Navy, and the granting of access for the benefit of profit to private corporations to these oil reserves via the bribing of politicians. Yeah, and so Doheny was charged with crime of such a nature in relation to the Teapot Dome scandal. He was accused of bribing Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall for naval oil leases. He was later acquitted of said accusation, it should be noted. Global involvement, pioneer of US exploitative policies, oil policies in Mexico. So Papa Garvey talks about oil concessions in Mexico. One of the major companies and one of the major individuals that received those concessions was, in fact, Edward L. Doheny. His ventures represent early U.S. extractive imperialism in Latin America. And this influence can be seen during the Mexican Revolution of 1920. Doheny was in there bribing officials, government officials, and attempting to corrupt the militias that were involved in the revolution in order to protect his access and to secure his access to the oil fields. In fact, he even funded private militias to protect his oil fields so that they were not conscripted, as Papa Garvey used earlier, by the masses who were in revolution. Harry Sinclair, also involved in the oil. Companies founded, Sinclair Oil Corporation. War involvement. Sinclair was a supplier, also a supplier during mass European Tribal War I. Political involvement. Used wealth to influence political appointments and contracts, especially under the Harding administration. Key figure also in the Teapot Dome scandal. He was convicted of jury tampering during the trial inspired by the Teapot Dome scandal. He was not acquitted. Sinclair Oil expanded operations in Canada, South America, and briefly into the Middle East, contributing to the internationalization of U.S. petroleum interests, brothers and sisters. Yeah, so we see that 100 years later, not much has changed in terms of the interests of these corporations. And finally, Albert H. Gary. His big business is steel. Companies founded. First chairman of the United States Steel Corporation, founded by J.P. Morgan. So we see J.P. Morgan again. War involvement. U.S. Steel played a critical role in Mass European Tribal War I, production and armaments and materials. So we've got the steel interest and we've got the oil interest all operating in Mass European Tribal War I. Political involvement, opposed labor unions like some of those before him, and played a major role in the suppression of the 1919 steel strike. Supported Republican pro-business policies, influenced tariff and labor policies, and played a mediating role between capital and the government during Mass European Tribal War I, particularly in war production. This is ensuring that the deals that were being struck in relation to this war with the government benefited the capitalistic interests that Papa Garvey was referring to earlier. Global involvement. U.S. Steel had international markets and subsidiaries in Latin America and Europe, advocated for open door policies, trade policies that favored U.S. industrial exports abroad. This is now going abroad and convincing other nations to open their markets to your products and using U.S. military and political might in order to secure the fulfillment of those interests. So now we've gone through all the names of all of those that were named by Papa Garvey. There could be more. One of them we're going to get into a little bit later on. But let's define what Papa Garvey means by concessions. Concessions refer to exclusive rights granted by a government, often a weaker or colonized nation, to a foreign individual, company, or state, allowing them to exploit natural resources, operate infrastructure, or conduct business within a designated area, usually in exchange for payments, royalties, or political favors. Key features of concessions include: the corporation is accommodated by the states. Governments, quote unquote, grant concessions, usually under duress or unequal treaties, to foreign corporations or investors. Exclusive rights often provided monopolistic control over land, resources, for example, rubber, oil, and minerals, or infrastructure, for example, roads or ports. And this is entirely important because at the same time as these antitrust laws and various different investigations were challenging the monopolies of American corporations in America, oftentimes same corporations or subsidiaries of corporations or related corporations were establishing monopolies elsewhere in the world, almost unchallenged, especially unchallenged in relation to the native or indigenous peoples of said nations. If the challenge was to come, it was going to come through another foreign, European, Western corporation. Long-term leases typically involved long-term duration, 30, 50, or even 99 years, as we'll get into later in the case of Firestone. Involvement of sovereignty frequently undermined national sovereignty, giving foreigners control over territory and labor within the concession. So in other words, this is what you call state capture, that the policies of the government and the interests of the people of the nation have been sacrificed to serve the interest of the corporation. used as a colonial tool, commonly used by imperial powers or corporations to extend control over foreign territories without formal colonization. So let's get into a few examples of these concessions and the various different companies that we've listed. In fact, we're going to get into one company that was listed and one company that was not in fact listed, yeah? And look at their relationship to war and the political economy of war. In 1924, the UNIA-ACL sent 2 delegations of agricultural and industrial experts to the West African nation of Liberia. The purpose that these delegations were designed to serve was to action the agricultural and industrial development program of the UNIA-ACL that had been initiated under the leadership of the most honorable Marcus MOSIAH Garvey. An estimated value of $50,000 worth of agricultural and industrial equipment was sent to Liberia with those delegations to start the program. And what happened was, when the second delegation landed, they were not able to disembark the ship. The goods, those that they brought with them and those that were previously sent, were confiscated from them. And they were told that they will not be allowed, despite all of the agreements that had taken place with the Liberian government under President Charles King previously, that all of those agreements are now null and void, and they would not be allowed to continue the program. The reason for the shift in the Liberian government policy in relation to the UNIA-ACL was in fact the fact that Liberia was surrounded by British and French colonies who had effectively banned either the UNIA-ACL as an organization, as an institution, as a government, or the institutions of the UNIA-ACL, for example, the Negro World newspaper. And the British and French forces were threatening to invade and colonize Liberia if too much revolution and rebellion was being fomented, particularly in relation to the UNIA-ACL. America was concerned about this because America was effectively in charge of Liberia. Liberia acted as a satellite of the American government. And so a British or French invasion would result in the loss of influence of the United States of America in Liberia. So the British government, the French government, and the American government all put pressure on the government of Liberia to betray the program that was initiated by the UNIA-ACL under the leadership of the most honorable Marcus MOSIAH Garvey. And in truth, when it comes to President Charles King, he is a man who did not need too much convincing, corrupt and anti-African as he was. And so when that particular incident took place in 1924, the UNIA-ACL held a convention in MOSIAH, August of that year, and decided to write a letter to the Liberian government warning them of what was about to take place. Because what happened was, in the wake of the Liberian government betraying the UNIA-ACL, the US government had sent a delegation to Liberia in the interest and with representatives of the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company for the sake of securing a concession in Liberia to access rubber in Liberia. And so the UNIA-ACL in convention wrote a letter to the Liberian government, and the letter in part reads, "It is generally known that certain members of the white race do not humor a government by darker peoples and weaker peoples, and it is our belief that as time goes on, the Firestone Rubber Company's interest will seek to further tighten its hold upon the Republic with the ultimate aim of superseding its government and placing it in the hands of the white race. We are asking you, therefore, if it is possible, not to ratify the concessions and to guard most jealously the freedom and integrity of your dear country. So did the Liberian government heed the warning of the UNIA-ACL? The answer is, unfortunately, no. What happened, brothers and sisters? Well, Liberia was negotiating this deal with Firestone at the behest of the American government from 1924. This agreement was put in place in 1926. As you can see, still exists to this day. In the early 1920s, the US sought to reduce dependence on British and Dutch controlled rubber, especially from Southeast Asia. The government of Liberia and Firestone Plantations Company, a subsidiary of Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, entered in an agreement for a 99-year lease on up to 1 million acres of land at 6 cents per acre. Liberia received a $5 million loan from Firestone to help pay off foreign debts, not to develop infrastructure, institutions and services, but to pay off foreign debts. A condition of this loan was that Liberia had to use American financial advisors appointed by Firestone to manage the loan and the national budget. We see again, state capture, that the policies of this nation are now serving the interest of a foreign corporation and a foreign government, brothers and sisters. Liberia went on to Firestone went on to effectively enslave the people of Liberia. The people of Liberia. Much of the land, by the way, that Firestone was given was land that had been apportioned and granted to the UNIA-ACL and its program through its relationship with the government and the people on the ground, the indigenous leadership on the ground in Liberia. That land was appropriated and granted to Firestone as a part of over 1 million acres of land at 6 cents per acre. They were basically given the land for free. They were not paying for the land, and therefore their profit margins significantly increased, brothers and sisters. And not only were they granted this concession, they were also had an influence over the policy of the Liberian government, specifically its monetary policy and its national budget, brothers and sisters. Yes? Liberia has suffered mass poverty and impoverishment from that time until this. And if you know the history of Liberia, you will know that many wars, what them call a civil war, has been fought in Liberia as a result. Another corporation that Papa Garvey did not mention, but which is extremely important, and he had dealings with, and the UNIA-ACL had dealings with, is the United Fruit Company, which is today known as Chiquita. The United Fruit Company operated in Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, Costa Rica, Panama, Nicaragua, Cuba, Jamaica, and the Dominican Republic. In fact, before Papa Garvey founded the UNIA-ACL, whilst he was traveling throughout South and Central America, he worked for the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica and encouraged the workers to unionize and strike, and had to leave the country because his activism through his strike leading and his newspaper, La Nation, which was advocating on behalf of the workers, the African workers in Costa Rica was, affecting the interest of the government and the United Fruit Company, among other corporations. And so they hounded him out of the country. So Papa Garvey had a long history with the United Fruit Company. Controlled actual or effective monopolies in bananas, land, railway, shipping, communications, banking, and trade. And so the primary business of the United Fruit Company is, in fact, fruit, bananas. But why are they in railways and shipping? Because they want to transport their bananas. So they had a fleet of ships and they built many railroads, not to develop infrastructure in the country that they were operating in, but simply as a means to transport and sell their bananas. Communications, same reason, banking and trade. They had a monopoly on the land, and therefore they were able to influence economies to the extent that they were able to control the banking and the trade policies of the various different nations that I've mentioned a while ago. Time doesn't allow, brothers and sisters, to go into the extreme depth, the extreme depth of the crimes of the United Fruit Company and their policies. But we do have a previous video on Kimbunga Media where we went into this in some significant detail, and I'll leave that in the card that you'll find above my head right now. Responsible for the banana massacre in Colombia in 1928. The banana massacre in Colombia in 1928 was sparked by a strike against the United Fruit Company that involved around 25,000 people in Colombia. And as a result of this strike, the United Fruit Company, because of its control of the government and with the authority and or endorsement of the US government, ordered the Colombian army to open fire on the strikers. And the justification for doing this is that they said the strikers were connected to Soviet Russia. Official government estimates at the time said that 47 people were killed as a result of the strikers being fired on. But there are estimates that range up to over 2,000 people were killed, brothers and sisters, as a result of this onslaught against a group of workers who were just trying to get better working conditions for themselves, working for the United Fruit Company. More details in the video that I mentioned earlier. The United Fruit Company is also responsible for the coup against President Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1958. This is one of them situations that you have to wonder at the audacity of imperialists. When you learn the history of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala and the United Fruit Company. One of the things that the United Fruit Company had a monopoly on, as I've already said, is land. Supposedly to grow their bananas. Well, by the 1950s in Guatemala, about 50% of all of the land in Guatemala was owned by the United Fruit Company. But one of the things that the United Fruit Company used to do is that it used to own large amounts of land, but only be actively developing and engaging and harvesting a proportion of it. But the ownership of the mass tract of land is designed to maintain its monopoly so that the land cannot be used by the indigenous or native population in a way that it would compete with their profits. That's one of the things that United Fruit Company used to do. And so land owned by the United Fruit Company was just going to waste, wasting away, wasn't being used, while the masses of the people in Guatemala were experiencing impoverishment because they were not able to maximize the productivity of the land in their own interest. Bearing in mind that the majority of what was being produced by the United Fruit Company was designed to serve the interests of the American market, brothers and sisters, and then the European market. And so this president, Jacobo Arbenz, comes to power in the 1950s, and decided to, well, hold on there, we've got to institute some policy around here to take away some of the land from the United Fruit Company. For about 40% of the land that they own. You can keep 60%, but 40% of the land that you own, and this is 40% of the land that you own that you're not using, and redistribute that land among the people of the nation to address the needs of poverty and underdevelopment and lack of industry and productivity among the people of the nation, to secure those industries in the interest of Guatemala. The US government and the United Fruit Company fabricate letters that are designed to connect Jacobo Arbenz with the, again, government of Soviet Russia, claim that he's a communist, and institute a program to overthrow his government, brothers and sisters. All for the purpose of protecting the monopoly of the United Fruit Company in Guatemala during that time. This is the level of criminality of these people. Later on, I think by this time, actually, the United Fruit Company is known as Chiquita. And this article, an interesting article, was released last year, 2024, brothers and sisters, entitled Banana Giant Held Liable for Funding Paramilitaries, published by the BBC News on the 11th of June, 2024. A few excerpts of this article reads, a court in the United States has found multinational fruit company Chiquita Brands internationally liable for financing a Colombian, so they're still in Colombia, paramilitary group. The group, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, which in Spanish the initials would be AUC, was designated by the US as a terrorist organization at the time, following a civil case brought by 8 Colombian families whose relatives were killed by the AUC. Chiquita has been ordered to pay $38.3 million, which is 30 million pounds, in damages to the families. During the 2007 trial, it was revealed that Chiquita had made payments amounting to more than 1.7 million to the AUC in the 6 years from 1997 to 1924. Sorry, to 2004. So we see, brothers and sisters, that the same situation that was taking place 100 years ago still a go on right now today in relation to some of the same corporations that Papa Garvey was identifying and dealing with and having to deal with during his lifetime, particularly as President General of the UNIA-ACL. The topic is MOSIAH and the political economy of war. So we've just detailed 2 examples of the kinds of concessions that Papa Garvey was referring to at the hands of these big individuals and their corporations, and the kind of exploitation that is coerced out of the people as a result, and the kind of unrest that ensues out of the dissatisfaction of the people trying to end the exploitation, and how these corporations and the American government, in concert with these corporations, behaves in response and as a result. This is exactly what Papa Garvey was dealing with. Yeah? So let's just give an example of how the UNIA-ACL itself had to do with the United Fruit Company. Well, Tony Martin, in his book Race First, informs us from Costa Rica, the Post Office Department found itself being prodded into action by an anti-Negro world coalition of the United Fruit Company, the British Consul, and the Costa Rican authorities. In September 1919, the Washington Council for the United Fruit Company wrote the Secretary of State and enclosed sample copies of the Negro World. Garvey's earlier sojourn in Costa Rica, which I mentioned earlier, had evidently not been uneventful, for the company remembered it clearly. The letter explained that Garvey, quote, left Limon in 1912 and that he is a typical noisy Jamaican. And if allowed to go on as he has been doing, there's a possibility of his attempting to repeat the French experience in Haiti. That line always just that line always mads me. Yeah, that this letter representing the British, American governments and corporations is afraid that what happened to the French in Haiti as a result of the Haiti revolution is going to happen. And then remember, the Haiti revolution is over 100 years previous to this. Brothers and sisters. But they're concerned that what happened to French government and corporations in Haiti is going to happen to American and British corporations in Costa Rica. He reported too that the government of Limon, with the agreement of the British consul, was planning to deport all those present at the next UNIA meeting. The United Fruit Company Council suggested finally that the Department of Justice assign its secret service to the case, since the UNIA was inciting revolution and thereby violating the neutrality of countries at peace with the United States. Similar correspondence was received from Costa Rican officials who, after banning the Negro world, requested the New York Post Office not to allow it to be mailed to Costa Rica. All in the interest of the United Fruit Company. We're seeing various different levels of warfare, particularly military war, economic war, and propaganda war. So the question then becomes, how does all of this relate and apply to us today in these times? We're going to take it up to the time, down to the minute. Well, as African people, we need to be informed, brothers and sisters, of Africa. We want to see, brothers and sisters, whether the scenario, the context in which Papa Garvey was speaking in 1923 still exists with us today, 102 years later in 1925. You want to know whether these concessions and the interests of these corporations from Britain and America and France and etc. are still the basis upon which many of the wars that we are experiencing today are being fought and initiated, brothers and sisters. We're going to start with discussing Africa, which is the U.S. Africa High Command, or the U.S. Africa Command, operating on the continent of Africa, brothers and sisters. U.S. Africa Command, with partners, counters transnational threats and malign actors, strengthens security forces and responds to crises in order to advance U.S. national interests and promote regional security, stability, and prosperity. So the Africa High Command, the U.S. Africa High Command, operates on the African continent, has military bases of the United States government on the African continent, and is engaged in running military operations on the African continent to the interest of the United States government, brothers and sisters. Sometimes, one of their major programs at the moment is training the troops of the armies of African nations so that they are purpose-built and designed to serve U.S. interests on the continent of Africa. The current head of AFRICOM, who is on his way out at the moment, as he's more or less served his term as the head of AFRICOM, is General Michael Langley, distinguished officer in the United States Marine Corps, currently serving as commander of the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM. He made history on August 2nd, 2022, by becoming the first black four-star general in the 246-year history of the Marine Corps. I've put that there, brothers and sisters, just to highlight the fact that we're still experiencing black firsts as far as the US military is concerned. This is the first black four-star general in 246 years. And when you consider the extent to which the African population of the United States of America is in fact overrepresented as far as its army demographics, you will understand how ludicrous that particular statistic is. But Michael Langley became famous earlier this year, what I'm called 2025, for making some statements, disparaging statements about Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, who many consider to be a revolutionary or at least a radical reformist leader in Burkina Faso. But I want to provide some more context for Langley's statement and play the broader clip, which includes the question preceding the answer that he gave that incensed the African world and caused us all to jump up and galvanize and organize on behalf and in solidarity with our people in Burkina Faso on the 30th of April. Look at the vibe.
The approach that we have had with USAID and the other things like the President's Initiative on AIDS, how does our U.S. approach compare and contrast to the approach of Russia in Africa and also Communist China in Africa?
Oh, Chairman, we've always had the lead. So what you're seeing in those two competitors or challengers, they're following in our wake. They see what works as far as our influence and deepening partnerships through those soft powers, whether it be health diplomacy or whether it be in development type programs. So they're following in our wake, trying to replicate what we do best. And I think the African countries know this, and so this is where, as we start to look at going forward, as State Department starts to reset these programs, looking at what worked and what didn't work, and doubling down on what does work. I think we have enough capital built up in these countries for them to ensure their stabilization and also prosperity. The other two competitors are just trying to replicate what we do best.
I can imagine a situation, though, in which the ruling elite of a country is receiving gratuities on the side that inure to the benefit of the strongman leader and not to the populace of the country. Does that sort of corruption and bribery go on with regard to the Belt and Road?
Absolutely, Chairman. I see this, and I don't mind calling them out, but Captain Traore and Burkina Faso, as they know that both, whether it's their gold reserves, that is all those proceeds are just in exchange to protect the junta regime. There's a number of examples across. Even in Sudan, what's going on with the rapid support forces and Burhan of the Sudan forces, when you get down to it, is all about the revenue that can be drawn out of that. And there are nefarious actors in the CCP or in sometimes Russia are complicit in those activities.
Okay, well, you can't imagine how frustrating it seems to me that this mineral-rich continent has not been able to move to a utilization of the resources to benefit the people there. After all this time, it's a puzzle that we haven't unwound.
is a puzzle that we haven't unwound. It's a puzzle, such a puzzle, because the US apparently doesn't act in ways in which it supposedly bribes, yes, the leadership of a nation to secure the interests of itself and its corporations. Bear in mind, brothers and sisters, that the context for this aspect of this corporation, that this is taking place, as it says, before the Senate, the US Senate Arms Committee hearing. Yes, the Senator, Mr. Wicker, has asked a question that about the our as in the US government's effectiveness in relation to competition with the governments of Russia and China and their associated institutions and corporations. This is the conversation, the context for the conversation. And General Michael Langley's response is, here we know, we are the real OG on the block in Africa. We know how the thing got. And not only do we know how the thing got, we set pace. We set trend. And Russia and China are just a try for do what we do a long time. That is what General Michael Langley is saying to Mr. Wicker. Well, Mr. Wicker knows he has a responsibility to differentiate what they are accusing China and Russia of doing with what the American government has done and is doing. So he asks, I can imagine a situation in which the masses of the people are being fleeced to serve the interests of the ruling elite in a nation. We've just given a number of examples of how the American government facilitated just that reality in Africa and in the Caribbean. But Mr. Wicker asked about this specifically in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is basically China's infrastructural development program around the world in, I think, 150-something different countries. They have a program to help and assist the development of infrastructure in order to facilitate the expansion of Chinese economic power and the Chinese market influence on the world. And America considers this to be a particularly serious threat because China is on course to overtake America as an economic superpower. And so this is a part of the propaganda warfare whereby they exempt themselves from the idea of bribery, even though they are the OGs in it, while charging China with bribery and connecting Chinese bribery to the most popular voice on the African continent that is considered to be bucking the trend and challenging the neo-colonial order as it has existed on the African continent from the 1950s and 60s until now, brothers and sisters. But the interest, remember, AFRICOM is designed to serve US interests, not African interests. So all this feigned concern for the fact that Africans have not been able to maximize the use of our resources is puppy show business. But the US military is having a conversation. It's not an economist speaking to the government. Yes? Not the Ministry of Finance. This is the Senate Arms Committee. This is a military conversation that is being had about access to and use of the resources on the continent of Mama Africa, brothers and sisters. Understand that what Papa Garvey said 100 years ago relates very much to what is happening today. I want to focus on now another aspect of this particular Senate hearing. Same Senate hearing, yes, that took place earlier this year, in which Mr. Reid spoke, brothers and sisters. Mr. Reid, who was opening the proceedings. And listen very carefully to how Mr. Reid opened the proceedings to this questioning of General Michael Langley.
In Africa, our adversaries have focused on building trade relationships while seizing influence from us. China's military ambitions on the continent are no secret, from their growing presence in Djibouti to the more than 100 seaports that have been constructed, financed, or operated by Chinese state-owned enterprises and could be used as dual use for future military contingencies. Russia has expanded its military engagement in Africa also, including by restructuring the Wagner Group's operations under an umbrella organization called Africa Corps, an historic irony of great proportions. They want to expand the reach of the Russian private military enterprise across the entire continent. Russia is also investing heavily in disinformation campaigns across the continent to spread anti-Western movements, undermine democracy, and promote Russian-backed authoritarian leaders, especially in regions like West Africa. It would seem that America's competitors recognize that to neglect Africa is to invite long-term strategic peril.
It would seem that America's competitors realize that to neglect Africa is to invite long-term strategic peril. My father is fond of saying, whoever controls Africa rules the world, brothers and sisters. And the Americans realize that their interest is built upon securing their influence and power over and within and among Africa and African people. But notice, brothers and sisters, the entire context of this conversation is competition with Russia and China. And the American government is afraid that Russia and China is going to beat them at their own game. This is not a conversation that is taking place in the context of justice. And we're not advocating Russia and China in Africa as we speak here. Russia and China in Africa, we will get into in another conversation at another time. Because we don't necessarily believe in that adage that the enemy of my enemy is necessarily my friend. It could just be another enemy. Whoever it is that we're dealing with, we must put race first and act in our own geopolitical and biocultural interest. But you will notice that the agency of African people is nowhere in this conversation. That fact, that dynamic is not present anywhere in this conversation. All that is being sought here is the interest of America, and they are highlighting different institutions and initiatives, especially economic institutions and initiatives of the Russian and the Chinese government in the context of a military conversation. Remember, Papa Garvey said that modern wars are generally speaking fought because of what? Dissatisfied capitalistic interests among foreign nations, nations foreign to the nation from which the capitalist interests come and are born, brothers and sisters. This is entirely important for us to take notice of in terms of contextualizing the application and the reality of Papa Garvey's words 100 years ago in relation to today. More can be said on this. We're going to go to President Donald Trump speaking in Europe during his first term, brothers and sisters, about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is an alliance of Western European countries, a military alliance of Western European countries. Let me quick hear what Trump has to say.
I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States. And many of these nations owe massive amounts of money from past years and not paying in those past years. Over the last 8 years, the United States spent more on defense than all other NATO countries combined. If all NATO members had spent just 2% of their GDP on defense last year, we would have had another $119 billion for our collective defense and for the financing of additional NATO reserves.
Donald Trump is charging the European NATO countries with slacking, with not investing heavily enough in American imperialists, European imperialists, Western imperialists, exploits in the world. He was banging that drum in his first term, as you saw, that was 2017. Since he's come back into power, he's begun to beat the same drum, brothers and sisters. And how has the governments of Europe responded? That now becomes a question. We're going to take an example from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and how Prime Minister Keir Starmer responded to the call of his brother across the waters, Donald Trump.
Starting today, I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. Yeah. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we reach that level in 2027. And we will maintain that for the rest of this Parliament. And let me spell that out, Mr. Speaker. That means spending £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we also face enemies that are sophisticated in cyber attacks, sabotage, even assassination. And so our intelligence and security services are an increasingly vital part of protecting both us and our allies. So on top of the funding of 2.5% that I've just announced, going forward we will recognise the incredible contribution of our intelligence and security services to the defence of the nation, which means taken together we will be spending 2.6% on our defence from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we must go further still. I've long argued that in the face of ongoing generational challenges, all European allies must step up and do more for our own defence. So, subject to economic and fiscal conditions and aligned with our strategic and operational needs, we will also set a clear ambition for defence spending to rise to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament.
So, brothers and sisters, you will find speeches such as that from the heads of governments of many European nations over the past year. They're all talking about raising up military spending, particularly to withstand the influence of Russia in Europe. America's major concern is sometimes Russia, but mostly at the moment, especially under Trump, it's China. But NATO is concerned in general with both of these nations and their influence. And so you see a rise in military spending. Now, bear this in mind. We spoke about earlier, Papa Garvey spoke about concessions and how the interests of corporations and the owners of corporations are being served by through warfare, brothers and sisters. Bear this in mind. Between 2020 and 2024, around 43% of all arms sales, yes, in the world were conducted and procured from American companies and corporations. In other words, American corporations dominate 43% of the arms industry between the years 2020 and 2024. No nation And no corporations of any other nation come anywhere close to the United States of America in terms of sales of arms. So it stands to reason that wherever a war is being fought in today's world, there is an American corporation that is profiting from that warfare. As far as Europe and NATO nations in Europe is concerned, between the period that I've just mentioned, 2020 and 2024, over 60% of all of their arms procurement was facilitated through buying arms from American corporations, brothers and sisters. And then we have the fact that Europe realizes that to the extent that it is going to up its arms capabilities, that there's going to be a sustainability problem in terms of whether America and American corporations are going to be able to continue to supply Europe with its arms. So there's a lot of talk about developing autonomy among Europe, or more autonomy among Europe in relation to arms. So now Europe is looking to invest in and grow its own arms industry, brothers and sisters. All of this is taking place in our current environment. And one of the things that is slightly different from Papa Garvey's time until now is that arms companies make up a far greater proportion of the global economy and stand to benefit directly from the fomentation of war in much the same way that oil companies do, and steel companies do, and banks do, and other companies, types of institutions do, brothers and sisters. This table just gives us an idea of some of these American companies that are benefiting and profiting from the warfare. So we've got Lockheed, this is just, by the way, brothers and sisters, the top 5, yeah? There are many, many more, at least 5 more significant ones, but I didn't want to overpack the presentation with information. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, who also are big in the plane business, and General Dynamics. And you can see the different expertise, level of expertise, what they produce, and so on and so forth, in the breakdown section of this particular graph table and the product section of this particular table. These are the major American corporations that are profiting the most from the arms industry and who have an interest in the fomentation of war in this particular dispensation of time. Our next table, keep to the word graph, relates to the British corporations, brothers and sisters. Yeah, we're not going to go through them. I just wanted to list this fact because these are among the corporations who are going to try to up their production in order to meet the demands of serving Western interests through NATO and so on and so forth, brothers and sisters. All right. The most interesting one that I learned about is Rolls-Royce Defense. Yeah, but anyone knows Rolls-Royce did the arms business, but that appears to be the case. Then now, if we were to look at the names that Papa Garvey mentioned in his editorial in 1923 and look for modern day equivalents of those individuals outside of the arms trade, who are the modern day equivalents of Morgan and Rockefeller and Doheny and Firestone and etc. in this day and age? And what influence do they have over the global economy? And how does this relate to war? So this is just a table that details some of that information. But I'm not going to go through and read all of it for time. Feel free to pause the video as it relates, as it interests you, and read. I just want to highlight, however, BlackRock, which is an asset manager, an investment company. Yeah, you can see here that JP Morgan is still big things, which is now JP Morgan and Chase. You can see here that ExxonMobil is still big things, brothers and sisters. These are related to the same corporations that Papa Garvey was talking about 100 years ago. You can see Elon Musk is listed here as the equivalent of Harvey Firestone, partly because, brothers and sisters, Harvey Firestone was instrumental in exploiting the resources of Mama Africa, as is Elon Musk. Yeah, particularly coltan and lithium and nickel and other resources that can be particularly found in the Congo. His companies and the development of his corporations are reliant upon access to those resources, not only through Tesla, but through Starlink, which is his space investigation institution that is in league with and in concert with the American government through NASA. Brothers and sisters can feel free to read further for more details. And then there's the equivalent, once again, as far as the UK is concerned. Feel free to check out, pause, and read these particular banks, corporations, and other institutions and individuals that are big on the global scene right here now and are the equivalent of the Morgans and the Rockefellers and the Firestones of 100 years ago. So one of the names on the American list of modern day equivalents was Eric Prince, private military contractor and resource extraction, born in 1969, and he is the founder of a private military, a private militia called Blackwater USA. He is no longer the head of that institution, and he is now the founder and head of the Frontier Services Group, and is involved with the Lancaster 6 Group and Project Opus. War involvement, instrumental in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, UAE, and the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ukraine. Political involvement, Republican Party donor, major influence in far-right libertarian defense circles, frequently called to testify before Congress about mercenary operations. So this is the US government contracting private militaries in its own interest, though accused of misleading lawmakers. Global involvement, developed large-scale logistics, security, and mining protection operations in South Sudan, Libya, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 2025, signed a deal with the Congolese government to secure mineral assets in exchange for taxation and security services. This is just this year, brothers and sisters. This Mozungu, Oyibo, Bakra, Obruni, Mundele, Tubab is signing deals with the Congolese government to secure mineral assets in exchange for taxation and security services. So when you see a deal being signed between Tshisekedi government and Kagame's government and Trump's government today, bear in mind, it didn't begin there. Before that point, this deal with Eric Prince, involving Eric Prince, had already been struck. But he went viral once again last year, 2024, for a statement that he made on his own podcast. He was being interviewed by one of his partners. He has a podcast that he runs, and he made a very interesting statement that went viral last year. Let's take it.
All this talk of illegal migration in Europe, in the United States, it ultimately comes down to a contest of what is governance. Who is governed? Which countries are governed well? And if so many of these countries around the world are incapable of governing themselves, then it's time for us to put the imperial hat back on to say, we're going to govern those countries if you're incapable of governing yourselves, because enough is enough. We're done being invaded.
Because our own national security risk is at stake.
Exactly.
National security interests are at stake.
You can say that about pretty much all of Africa. They're incapable of governing themselves and benefiting their citizens. because the governments there are all about looting and pillaging and lining their pockets and going shopping in Paris instead of actually
hold on
making
a
the
second.
country
Hold
a
on.
better
People on the
land.
left are going to watch this. They're going to say, wait a minute, Eric Prince is talking about being a colonialist again.
Absolutely. Yes. Enough. Because if you go to these countries and you see how they suffer under absolutely corrupt, made-up governments that are just criminal syndicates, the people of Africa, the people of Latin America, a lot of them deserve better.
So, brothers and sisters, we have the founder of a private military, a mercenary squad, hired by the American government and maintaining influence within American politics, openly campaigning for the recolonization of Africa and South and Central America. And as a student of Nana Amos Wilson, I'm always inspired not just to respond or react and cuss bomber in relation to what devils like this say, but to also, after a cuss bomber, we have to look at exactly how and why and in what context the statement is being made, because he's speaking on a podcast, his own podcast, which is a form of media. So we have to ask the question, not just look at the audacity of the background for say these things, but why is this being said now? What purpose is designed to serve? Why would an individual in 2024, with all of the history of US and European colonization and imperialism, publicly declare a desire to recolonize Africa at this moment in time? I'm not even saying that I have a complete answer to that question. What I am saying is that a statement like this is not made publicly by a man such as this for no reason. There is a strategic benefit to making this statement at this moment in time that we have to be concerned with. But he is one such, like J.P. Morgan and Firestone and Rockefeller, who exist in this time, for who and through who U.S. interests are being actioned through the fomentation of war for the purpose of securing the profit of U.S. corporations and individuals such as himself. Another example of this, brothers and sisters, was seen recently, where we saw the development of Detachment 201, Executive Innovation Corps. In June 2025, the U.S. Army launched Detachment 201, Executive Innovation Corps, bringing in 4 senior tech leaders as lieutenant colonels in the U.S. Army Reserve. These include Andrew Bosworth, CTO at Meta, Shyam Sankar, CTO at Planeteer, Kevin Wheel, CPO at OpenAI, Bob McGrew of Thinking Machines Lab. This is now the corporate world being drawn directly into the U.S. military, brothers and sisters, to serve U.S. interests around the world. Add that to the AFRICOM that I mentioned earlier. Add that to SouthCom, which is the equivalent of AFRICOM operating in South and Central America and the Caribbean. SouthCom is involved right now with the United Nations Security Support Mission in Haiti at the moment. Brothers and sisters, suppressing the people of Haiti, their labor, their resources, and their natural and informed will. Southcom is involved in Haiti at this very moment in time. But what's even more interesting in context with Papa Gari's pronouncements is the fact that all of these cutting edge industries in digital and what they call artificial intelligence, AI technology, having been brought into the US military, we shouldn't miss the fact that all of their industries are reliant upon the procurement of resources from Africa and the Caribbean, and the labor, the undervalued and cheap labor of African people. An example of this, brothers and sisters, these companies and their industries are reliant upon cobalt, coltan, bauxite, gold, manganese, uranium, rare earth minerals, lithium, oil, and natural gas. And you can pause the video and see what the use of these minerals are within the industries that are being represented by the companies that have just been referenced and more. And you can see in the right hand column of this particular table where these major resources can be found. They can be found in the Congo, Rwanda, Burundi. And there's a question as to the extent to which coltan and tantalum can be found in Rwanda and Burundi, but it is a known fact that these nations represent among the highest sellers of these resources, brothers and sisters. In other words, Rwanda and Burundi secure these resources on behalf of the American government and related Western corporations. Guinea, Jamaica, Haiti, Ghana, Mali, South Africa, Suriname, Gabon, Niger, Namibia, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Angola, Ghana, Guyana, Trinidad, and Tobago. This is just a list of some of the vital resources that are needed by these industries in order for their corporate bosses and founders and managers to enrich themselves. And we see through the induction of these individuals and their corporations into the US military the same situation that Papa Garvey identified 100 years ago playing itself out. That wars in our current environment are being fought to service the interests of big capitalist corporations. The question then becomes, will we as a people come to the same conclusion as Papa Garvey in terms of how we relate to these corporations? Will we make the decision to disrupt the machinations of these corporations? Will we advocate among ourselves and in our own nations to conscript and confiscate the wealth of these corporations in so much as they have been built upon the exploitation of our people and have been used as an excuse to foment war among African people in the interest of US corporations? As we conclude, Papa Garvey says, the battles of the future, whether they be physical or mental, will be fought on scientific lines. And the race that is able to produce the highest scientific development is the race that will ultimately rule. Brothers and sisters, we are seeing that US corporations who are at the cutting edge of technology and scientific development in today's world are reliant upon the exploitation of African land, labor, and resources. And so therefore it stands to reason that Abibi Tumi, Abibi Fahodi, African power and African liberation is going to be dependent to a significant degree upon the extent to which we are able to dismantle that particular program and employ our labor, our land, and our resources to meet our own revolutionary, anti-neocolonial, and universal African nationalist interests and program as a race of people. I conclude this presentation at this point. MOSIAH and the political economy of war, capitalism and the state. I hope ones and ones have gained something in knowledge, information, and or inspiration from these remarks, brothers and sisters. And I hope that we continue to use the words, the wisdom, the work of the most eminent prophet, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, and all of our great ancestors to the ultimate benefit of the masses of our people at large. One God, one aim, one destiny. Garvey lives, Mosiah lives.
Look for me in a world when I look up.